Give him a round of applause.
Oh, there we go. I was like, can we dim the lights so everyone can see what's going on? Shout outs to the code rap. I was like, oh man, if I'd known, I would have laid some verses down. All right, so hello, my name is Henri. Yes, I do speak French, so I'm going to play around with the... Oh, do we know some French? Yeah? Un peu de français, peut-être? Oui, non? Okay, I'm not going to do that. And yes, my name's Henri. My last name isn't Helvetica. It's just my Twitter handle, but a lot of people always ask me, like, oh, that's the coolest last name. I'm like, it's not my last name. And most of the time, half the crowd leaves. And since you're still here, we're going to rock. All right, so we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics. First of all, I like to talk about performance quite often, most of the time, in fact. And I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is images online. So welcome to Optimize Prime. It's all about more pixels than meets the eye. And this is going to have a bit of a, I'd say, a penchant towards mobile, because that's pretty much what people use every day. And you're going to realize that images are pretty toxic on the mobile platform. That's my Twitter handle. If you want to hit me up, send me some hate mail or hate tweets, whatever that might be. But you may not after this talk. So let's go. We're going to talk about images. Now, really, images are super important. And again, you're going to see that when we're dealing with images and mobile, we have to be very disciplined on how we sort of serve them up to the client. And specifically, we're going to get right down to it. Images are too big. Quite often enough, they're sized improperly, and the image weight is not where it needs to be. Because again, when you're talking about mobile, you're talking about clients that are not as powerful as desktop devices. So again, we're going to jump right into it, and we're going to see that large images, part of the challenge that we have are things like responsive web design. Who's familiar with responsive web design here? Hands up. All right, all good. So you have your media queries and whatnot, and sometimes you'll make mistakes, and you'll end up with, say, an image that's 2,000 pixels across in a thumbnail. That should not be happening. Images, they kill data plans. One thing you have to understand, that images, quite often enough, outside of video, are going to be your largest resource on your page. With that being said, pardon me, it's going to be your largest source of data all the time. And that's absolute truth. And in fact, if you look at this slide right here, you'll see that we're actually sending almost the exact same amount of data to mobile phones as we are to desktop. But the mobile phone is drastically underpowered versus desktop computers. So I'm going to get into the details later, but you're going to see how caustic that is and toxic to the user experience as well. Large images, they are the victims of the network. Now, when I'm talking about the network, earlier today, I think Ben talked about, he recommended this book, which was High-Powered Network something. Nonetheless, the networks are basically the limiting reagent for the chemistry people out there. 2G, 3G, 4G, depending on what the network is, the large image cannot come down the pipe fast enough. So that's why you have to optimize your images as much as you can so you can have a proper user experience and your site can load as fast as possible. Now, this is a bit of an antiquated map, but this was actually a Facebook graphic indicating some of the opens across the world. And 2G, 3G, and 4G, you can see, are pretty much spread across. But ultimately, there's a lot less 4G than some people realize. In fact, if you want more recent data, you can look at this chart right here, and you can see right there that 2G and 3G pretty much dominate the planet. And in fact, 2G is pretty much what is the most prevalent network connection across the globe. So you need to keep these things in mind while you're designing your apps and your web apps or dealing with assets as well. Now, large images, they will also burn your battery. Essentially, when an image is being decoded on your device, that's basically using up CPU. CPU needs to be powered. Power comes from the battery. And who's ever been, say, I don't know, on Instagram with 10% left, and you're scanning through Instagram and it goes from 10 to 0? That's what's up right there. Large images, they also they use up a lot of memory. So essentially, the image dimension is going to be proportional to the memory being used. So the larger the image, the more memory is being used right there. So what that means is that you can end up with app crashes. Out-of-memory errors are actually very prevalent on Android phones especially, and a lot of times that's due to the excess of images that you're scanning through. So these are things you really want to keep in mind when you're sort of like putting together your image management story. Now, I realize I'm racing through because I only have 15 minutes, but I'm totally going to be available for questions that you have afterwards. So let's go. What are we talking about? We're talking about images. We're talking about image formats and essentially what they're best at. Now, when you start to do some research around image or performance in general, but especially around image performance, you're going to quite often enough hear the word bloated, or this site is bloated, this image is bloated. It essentially means that it's too heavy. It's coming in too big at 1 meg, 2 megs, 3 megs or more, and sized way too large. So you're going to hear me talk about it, and also when you go back and read some documents, you're going to probably see that as well. So I'm a big advocate of knowing your image formats, what they're best at, what their qualities are, what they're not good for. So we're going to cycle through that right now. So let's look at our favorite pair of programmers right here. Bay and Jay. Jay and Bay. And we're going to look at this image, and we're going to see what its best use case is in terms of an image format. So would this be good as a GIF? Who says yes? Hands up. All right, we have one person. I don't know. So this is why it's not good as a GIF. The GIF was basically, it's an antiquated format. Really, it's limited to 256 colors. So it's not going to be good for pictures. Also, the GIF is something I'd say to avoid simply because, again, it's older. It's quite bloated most of the time. So you still see some GIFs are out and about through some videos and whatnot, cat videos as everyone likes. But this is something I would definitely not recommend. So if I keep going and I say, well, maybe I should use a PNG here. Hands up if you think a PNG would be awesome. Okay, a lot of tentative folks here. Well, you know what? PNG ain't bad. However, I would actually issue a warning. Now, PNG is another format that's going to be largely bloated because it is a lossless format. It is going to be, there's actually 2 versions of PNGs. It's actually going to be pretty good for photographic uses, but again, it's going to be quite often enough bloated, so I would be very careful about using the PNG. Now, would I use this as an SVG? Hands up if you think so. Okay, we have one. Unfortunately, absolutely not. Now, the problem with the SVG, well, it's not a problem, but the SVG was not used or made for photographic imagery, more for illustrations, maybe a map, or certainly a logo, like the New York Knicks. I'm in New York, let's go. Or New York Mets, that would be perfect for SVG, or hell, New York Giants. So I would definitely not use for SVGs for anything other than that right there. Now, who's familiar with the WebP? It was discussed earlier by Ben. Okay, so it's kind of like a newer format. It's something that's owned by Google. In this case, would I use a WebP? Absolutely. WebP I'm going to talk about a little later as well. It's a pretty aggressive encoding process, so images could come in pretty small, but WebP would be absolutely perfect for this. Now, ultimately, would this be a good JPEG? Hand up? Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Still not a lot of hands up. This is absolutely perfect. The JPEG was made for this kind of scenario. Photography, absolutely. And it's actually a lossy format, so it came out of, that's essentially what it's good for. Now, what else do I want to talk about when it comes to images? And specifically, I'm going to talk about the JPEG. Who's familiar with exif data? Any photographers here? All right, that's awesome. So exif data is something that you actually want to keep in mind. Now, what is it really? Well, it's some metadata that's quite often enough embedded to the image, And we're going to go back to our pair programmers. Now, $100 cash for anyone who could tell me who shot this photo. Okay, I didn't think so. So, his name was Adam Hunger. Now, you may not know, but all that information was embedded into the photo. And in fact, there were about like 200 fields of data in this photography. I'm like, what? And this is information actually that for the web is actually useless. So this is stuff that you actually want to actually remove from the photo before you send it to your app. Now, on average, exif data takes about 14% of your image. So for a 100K image, you're looking at 14K. Now think about that on scale. What if you have like 10 photos that are 100 image each? And that's quite often the case, sometimes more. And 100K is actually fairly small, so it could be even bigger. Keep that in mind. So what do we want to do with all this information? We know image formats, we know we have to remove some of the exif data, but for sure, using the image formats to their best abilities, you want to use the picture tag. Now, who's familiar with the picture tag here? Who's used it in a project? Okay, so let me just read this real quickly. It's a responsive images method to control which image resource a user agent presents to a user based on the resolution, media query, and or support for a particular image format. So, especially that last line, that's super important. In plain English, this means that depending on the format you're using, or depending on the browser that is being used, you may get a different image format being served. So let's look at a very simple example right here. Now, I know I'm close to the middle, so I'm going to use the laser. So we have three formats that are going to be served depending on the browser that comes about. We have the WebP, JPEG XR, and the classic JPEG. If a browser like Chrome comes around, WebP is what's going to be served. Now, if a browser, say like Edge HTML, they're going to get the JPEG XR, and if nothing else like or something like Firefox comes around, they're going to get the JPEG because they don't support the other two. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you could be disciplined by having all these formats ready to go and serve the best format possible in the smallest way possible as well. Now, why is this important? Because we're going to go back to our pair programmers here. This is the photo that I found online yesterday. By the way, I completely redid this deck after I was like, oh man, I have this new idea. So I wasn't originally going to use these two, but it was just fitting. This photo was originally 5 megs, and I found it online. I'm like, okay, I'm going to use this. As a WebP, it came out to 531 kilobytes. Okay, now that was fairly aggressive in the encoding, but quite often enough, you are going to be able to save 50 to 60% depending. Now, like I said, that's about 90% smaller. Why is this important? Because this format is going to be supported by Chrome, of course. Now, UC Browser uses the Blink engine, which is Chrome. So does Samsung Internet, so does Opera, and so does the Android default browser. What does that mean? You could probably have like about 70 to 75% of mobile clients covered simply by using the WebP. So again, we're trying to save data and serve the smallest image possible, and you could do that by employing something like that. Now, let's take a look at some of the tools that we have available. So essentially, I'm a big fan of DevTools. If you go into DevTools right away, you can see how big your page is. You can look at the waterfall, but specifically, you'll see right here, it was 24 megs, and most of that were images. So you can tell right away how big and heavy your page is, but you'll never know just by looking at your phone. These are things you want to keep in mind. You want to use things like ImageOptim. ImageOptim is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, image compression tool. It employs all the best encoders out there, managed by a fantastic image engineer. Lighthouse is actually an auditing tool that's part of Chrome. and it basically will do a performance audit and tell you what it feels you could be doing. So for example, I was looking at the Honda site, blah, 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 but specifically it'll say, hey, there's an opportunity here to save some data, about 2 megs, and you'll probably save about 10 seconds on load. All right, these are things you want to do. So where are we going to go from here? Well, unfortunately, there are some more formats we can deal with. Now, there's JPEG XR, like I said, JPEG 2000, which is something that's supported by Apple. And then there's this thing called HEIF. Any late model phones, iPhones, is actually shooting photography in HEIF, but it's not being supported by the browser just yet. But something that you want to keep in mind, it's in the notes. We have this thing called client hits, where you'll be able to actually take all the heavy lifting, the heavy sort of like coding out of your hands and give it over to the browser. And the browser will serve the right image depending on like size, screen density as well, because I didn't really talk about Retina, but that's very important. And then CDNs were talked about earlier. Let a different company take care of all the heavy lifting for you. Now, why are we doing all this ultimately? Well, it's all about user experience. Images create fantastic engagement. We know that. I mean, like, imagine Instagram with no images. Imagine Facebook with no images, because Facebook was originally deemed as like an image sort of like social network. Images can be really toxic to the user experience, because if they download slowly, it's like you're sitting there waiting, and that's not what you want to do. And like I said, when images don't load fast, you have poor user experience. Now, this stat was talked about earlier today. I'm going to repeat it again, because this was a double-click study on mobile at 3G. 53% of visitors will abandon a page that takes 3 seconds or more to load. That's 3 seconds only. And in fact, if you can expand that, 77% of pages load in 10 seconds or more, with the average coming in at 19 seconds. 19 seconds. Look at the stopwatch.
Please look at me.
All right, thank you, Pat.
Thank you, everybody.
That really did happen. So that was 19 seconds. Think about a page loading in that long. So ultimately, in Compendium, user experience must be a priority one, and be sure to optimize your images. And that's really it. Now, real quick, bonus cuts, all right? Last night, I took down all the Codeland images to see what was going on. I was able to save, what is that, 80%. There was like a 4 meg image on the Codeland page. Shouldn't happen. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, you should not have a 1 meg image or more, or I mean, anything past like even 800K on a page. It's especially not for mobile. It's not necessary. And all it takes is a little bit of like testing, little research, and making sure that, yeah, it might look good on the phone, but you want to make sure that it comes in at a decent weight. Do I have time for a quiz? Yeah? Okay, quickly. Who could tell me what GIF stands for? Bam, my man. That's for you. Ready? Oh, my bad. I'll hand it to you. Anyways, thank you very much. My name's Henri. I'll talk to you guys after.
All right. Awesome job. Awesome job.